You're listening to Back to Us Radio on the Back to Us Network.
It takes 12 years to create a graduate. It takes about the same time to create a dropout. And at the end of the day, the difference between a child becoming one or the other could be you. So United Way is asking you to make a pledge. Tutor a child who needs help. Mentor a kid who needs someone on their side. Volunteer to read to children. Because when a child advances, we all advance. Be a reader, tutor or mentor, give, advocate, volunteer, live united. Take the pledge now at liveunited.org. Brought to you by United Way and the Ad Council.
Who have I become? 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 Throw tight, midnight, wait up by the lamplight like a housewife. Can't sleep, can't sing, staring at the phone, still it won't ring. Get back,
Good evening, Strong Stance listeners. We've got another wonderful show for you. And without further ado, let's just jump into this thing. A month ago, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that same-sex marriage is now legal nationwide. NPR's Nina Totenberg said that this case, Obergefell v. Hodges, is a landmark ruling that is, quote, right up there with Brown v. Board of Education and Roe v. Wade. Facebook exploded with rainbow flags, and the White House was lit up in rainbow spotlights, and people celebrated in the streets, in their homes, and at events. But how does this decision affect the transgender and gender nonconforming community? How big is this win for us? And obviously there's still work to be done, so where do we go from here? On this episode of The Strong Stance, we have two guests that will unpack this decision and discuss the questions and work that remains. So join us as we engage in a translation of marriage equality. The first of our guests is Jessica Lynn O'Donnell. Jessica Lynn is a 41-year-old MTF transgender female. She knows all too well just how very real and debilitating gender dysphoria can be when it's left untreated. She did what she felt she needed to do to improve her quality of life and find a way to get her gender dysphoria under control. She decided it was time in October 2010, after 2 failed attempts of taking her own life, to tear down those walls of isolation and seclusion by seeking medical intervention. She found her therapist in May of 2010 and started self-medicating in October that same year. Her therapist strongly advised against self-medicating and advised she find a doctor. Jessica took her therapist's advice, and by the end of January 2011, she was finally living openly and authentically as who she was always meant to be. She's now living her life as she sees fit for her and no longer deals with the burden of gender dysphoria. Jessica is the founder of Trans Life Radio, and she's currently working with others from our community, creating a website to be used as a resource for helping other transgender people through their struggles, promoting and advertising other transgender and LGBT groups, organizations, and businesses in the LGBT community. They are also creating the site as a means to archive and air their upcoming shows. So I want to welcome Jessica. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, thank you, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And also joining us is Crispin Torres. Crispin is an educator, activist, and rock musician located in Chicago by way of Mexico City. He spent the last 15 years working in the LGBTQ advocacy, organizing, and education. He has taught gender studies and American history at DePaul University and Chicago Public Schools. Beyond his advocacy roles, Crispin is a performer and recording artist. He's toured and played guitar for the now defunct the Chicago Punk Rock Quartet, The Recruitment, and is featured in Chicago's premier gay Alanis Morissette punk rock cover band, You Fucking Oughta Know. He currently serves as Lambda Legal's Midwest Regional Community Educator, is the co-director of the Trans 100, and serves as board president for Trans Tech Social Enterprises. Crispin, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Glad to be here.
So, I really I want to thank you guys, obviously, for being here. The wealth of your experience and knowledge, I feel like, is going to bring, a lot of great discussion to this topic. But let's start by, obviously, look, a lot of people were very happy about marriage equality, and for good reason. And a lot of people in and outside of the trans and gender nonconforming communities weren't so happy with it, or rather, they felt like it was focused too much on it, that it wasn't our primary issue. So let's break this down a little bit and start first with, where is marriage equality a win, right? What are the positive aspects of marriage equality for the larger LGBT community before we get into kind of how it may or may not positively affect the trans community. Because obviously, being able to marry, whoever you choose as a consenting adult in a country that claims to treat everyone equally under the law is an important right to have. And whether or not it's our most important right, I feel like it's one of those things that it's like, oh, well, this never should have been this big of a fight to begin with, but it's still a win in a way. So Jessica, how do you see, like, just kind of overarching, where do you see marriage equality as a win for the larger LGBTQ community, and including those T's and Q's?
Well, I particularly see it as a huge win on the aspect of, the fact that, to me, love is love. Love does not see gender. Love does not see anything but the love that you have for the other person. So, essentially, I would say that it's a huge win because basically marriage was stipulated, if that's the correct word, was stipulated as that marriage was only valid if it was with someone of the opposite sex, which that kind of seems kind of biased to me in a situation, because not everybody's going to love someone of the opposite gender, or anything like that. So to me, that's a huge win because the LGBT as a whole, if you are with someone that is the same sex and you don't have those same rights, well, you no longer have rights what if something happens to your spouse? You no longer have those rights to be the spokesperson for your spouse when you know them the best. It goes to the family. Anything that comes from it, you're no longer going to get any of those memories that you made with that person. So it is a very huge win in a lot of, in my eyes.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And obviously there are, we've made this statement before on this show, but there is a distinct difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. So we're obviously not saying that trans people can't or aren't also gay, because there are gay trans folks, there are bisexual trans folks, there are queer trans folks, there are straight trans folks, but, whatever the case may be. So Crispin, where, whether it's personally, not necessarily legally, but if there is some legal aspect, absolutely. But personally, legally, what do you see? How do you see this as a win for the larger queer community, or the trans community specifically?
When I think about marriage equality, usually I tend to think more specifically about the children of families that are queer and gay and lesbian, bisexual. I think oftentimes we as queer folks, we're sort of inundated with all these images of same-sex couples that are mostly white and mostly men, and they're represented sort of in these, big campaigns run by national LGBT organizations, and that's not necessarily always the truth, right? But it is the kind of predominant image that we've had in the culture. But for me, I think the big piece, the real big win with the SCOTUS decision is sort of the cultural the downpour, really, that we're going to have, the cultural shift that's going to happen in the next few years. And it's something that I think as LGBT folks, such as myself, that live in sort of this bubble oftentimes, where we are around other queer people and around other LGBT people, that kind of, we select those safe spaces, it's sort of survival. But one of the things that we forget, right, is that there's tons of LGBTQ families out there that are trying to access this right to celebrate their love, but also really to legitimize their children and legitimize their families and allow their children to grow up in a world where they don't have to explain, why their moms are married, or why, their dad and their mom are married in Indiana, but they're not in Idaho, or whatever the example might be. But I think that cultural shift is something that is we may not feel it now, but in 15 years, we're going to look back and say, wow, that is something that we really didn't see as as a result of marriage equality, but it's really changed lives in a very different, real way. It's going to change the way that people think about LGBT people and about gender and about relationships, and I think that change is a positive one, and that for me is the biggest, one of the biggest wins for the larger community.
You know, that's a really excellent point, because you're right. I don't think, you know, occasionally we do bring up the kids. Unfortunately, a lot of times it's the anti-marriage equality folks that generally bring up the kids and how damaging it is for kids. When in reality, the damage does come when there isn't that legitimizing, right? If you live in a state where your marriage isn't recognized and you either can't afford or have not had the chance to, or the state does not allow second parent adoption, if something happens to that biological parent or that legal parent, that can really put that child in a very precarious situation without something like marriage equality. On top of, like, what you were saying, that, look, being a kid is not easy, right? You know, kids get bullied. That's what happens. We want to change that and stop that. But, you know, explaining things to children that see things so black and white is it's difficult. It's a burden. I think that's a really great point, and I'm really glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I think that what's interesting is, so we mentioned that obviously, you know, trans people can be gay, and so therefore you can have a need for a same-sex, you know, marriage in even as a trans person. But I think that what a lot of folks don't really think about, and a lot of trans folks think about this, although I've had this conversation with some people and they were like, oh God, I didn't even think about that, is the fact that if you're living in a state that, if you identify as a straight person, or you are a trans person that, whether you identify straight or you're with someone who is of the opposite gender as you, but you're living in a state that does not allow you to change your legal gender markers, you know, you may be a man in a relationship with a woman, but if the law still says that you're female and the law says that your partner is female, then marriage equality plays a big role in your life as a trans person. Whether you consider yourself in a same-sex marriage or not, it's something that at least band-aids. I mean, honestly, what we also should be going after, is changing the state laws and how you can change those gender markers. But until that happens, this is kind of a stop. I see this as kind of a stopgap for some of those folks that are living either in a state where they can't change it, or do not possess the monetary funds that it requires to go through the type of reassignment that most states require, or quite frankly are genderqueer and they don't feel the need to medically transition. Like, in all of those cases, it's a very real possibility for you to end up in what the law would consider a same-sex relationship.
Right. And I just wanted to interject on that for a second, because it's funny you say that, because I've been saying that, you know, basically it kind of works on a case-by-case basis. And, you know, it's so great that it took it to all 50 states, made it more of a federal law than a state-by-state law, you know, which I feel personally that they should do away with the state laws, the individual states, and when one law is passed, it goes for all 50 states in the nation. You know, in my opinion, as far as that goes. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that the whole state-by-state law thing, I think that the hardest thing that I grapple with is that the rights of the minority should never be voted on by a majority. It just, you know, history has proven time and time again that when the majority gets a chance to vote on the rights of the minority, oftentimes they get it wrong a lot of times before it gets corrected or gets right. Crispin, I don't know if you have any experience with, given the fact that you work at Lambda Legal, I'm sure that you are probably a wealth of statistics and information, but you know, I don't know how you feel about that. I've read several kind of, if you look at different historical perspectives on any time that the rights of the minority are put up to a popular vote, it tends to not work out so well for the minority community.
I mean, I see that perspective. I do think, though, that, you know, with particular regard to LGBT issues, it's a little bit more complicated, right?